Good morning, Vietnam. Welcome to another episode of the Vietnam Innovators podcast. Without you, the show would not be possible. So thank you for tuning in every single week for the past few years. Appreciate and make sure you subscribe wherever you're listening to our podcast today. Today we have a special guest. He was supposed to be here a few months ago. Some scheduling mistakes, but all good. We're back in the studio here today. Dominic Scriven, the founder of Dragon Capital. Dragon Capital is, I think, a 30-plus-year-old firm here, investing in Vietnam, for Vietnam, building for Vietnam, doing really cool stuff. I'm excited personally to also learn from Dominic himself. Welcome to the studio, Dom.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
Is Dom okay, or is it Dominic?
That's cool.
Okay, Dom.
That works.
So if you see Dom on the street, say hi. So Dom, it's great to have you here today. Why don't we just start with a quick little introduction, who you are, how long you've been here. Would love to hear your personal story.
Thank you for your curiosity. I was born in Britain in the early 1960s, educated there, but only worked for like a year or two in Britain, and then headed to Hong Kong, worked there for 4 or 5 years, and then came to Vietnam. First as a student in Hanoi University, 1992. And then without any actual plan of staying, I did a couple of years at uni, and then I did stay and started Dragon with some mates, and that's where I've been since.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you arrived in 1992 as a student in Hanoi.
Correct.
And according to my notes, you started in 1994.
Dragon started in 94.
94.
Yeah.
So you were basically a professional for like 2 years, more or less, before you started your company.
I was a student.
Oh, you were a student at the time still.
I was a student at Hanoi University.
Okay.
Yeah. It was then called Đại học Tổng hợp. It's now part of Vietnam National University. I think I actually started at the end of 91, but effectively it's 92. And my objective was to learn Vietnamese. And my reason for learning Vietnamese was because I wanted to learn a tonal language. Because the concept of an ideographic approach to linguistics has always interested me. It's very different to the Western phonetic version. And of course, Vietnamese, while dating from characters is not actually now, as we know, the characters are not effectively used. And so it was that much easier learning in a Roman alphabet. But of course, as I get older, I now realize I actually want to learn the characters. So that's my retirement plan.
Yeah, which language is next?
It'll be characters in, Vietnamese nom characters, if I can find any of them, or if not, then maybe I have to study Chinese characters.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So back in 1991, 92, where in Britain were you from? Are you from?
I'm from the middle, but I approached Vietnam from Hong Kong.
What's your football club? I think that'll help the Vietnamese listening to better understand where.
Yes, well, I'm sorry to be very disappointing. I don't really have a football club.
Oh, no.
I mean, when I was a kid, Tottenham Hotspur was the guy Spurs, but really because I like the name, I never went to a Spurs match.
Okay.
I've been to Chelsea matches, a couple of Chelsea matches. First ever football match I watched was Chelsea and Barcelona, and the score was 4-2. I mean, when you see a match like that, you don't need to watch many others, do you?
Yeah.
Really? Yeah.
Okay. So back in 91, and I think for even the English folks and the UK folks listening here today, what spurred your interest in Vietnam specifically, aside from the language? Like, because what keeps you here too after so long? Is it I'm trying to avoid the more generic answers like, oh, because I speak Vietnamese or I love the culture. But is there something that really draws you to this place that continues to keep you here?
So people in my generation grew up high school, university, far away from Vietnam in Europe. But Vietnam featured in my education, in the unofficial bits of my education. So when I was at university, the politics at university centered around, we had a big miners' strike in Britain, but the real one was Nicaragua, Sandinistas and their struggle against the United States. And people frequently made reference to the fact that Vietnam was a hero of the underdog. And that appeared very, very widely in culture. I think particularly music. The music that we used to listen to. A lot of reggae. I sort of grew up after Woodstock, right? But, there's in the shadow of Woodstock, there's all of that stuff. And so the culture of my generation, Vietnam was part of it, really. Although subliminally, right? Then I was in Hong Kong and I came on a trip. It was a professional trip from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City to have a look at the emerging or not emerging prospects for investment. And during that trip, I thought, well, I'm not sure about the prospects for investment, but here is this extraordinary country with an extraordinary history and an extraordinary present, sitting slap in the middle of Asia. And yet nobody seems to be engaging very much with Vietnam. This is 1990. So, of course, we remember in 1990, 1991, Vietnam's great friendships were with what was then called the Comecon bloc, right? And that was, of course, beginning to crumble. Gorbachev, Yeltsin. And in many ways, I think it was obviously a very, very difficult time for Vietnam because, the friendships were limited. China, there were tensions. The United States had an embargo. The rest of Southeast Asia was really huddled in ASEAN, which was established as a bolster of defences against Vietnam. So it appeared very guiling, entrancing, and compelling, actually, that I wanted to be there and understand why this was the case. Yeah. And language, going to a university when I was 28, I think I was 28. I'd worked for a few years. The prospects of going back to university when you're 28, I mean, who wouldn't love that? And I have to say I've never, ever, ever regretted that time being a student. There weren't many students, of course. And I had one teacher from Haiphong, and he had one student for 2 years. It was a most glorious part of my life. And at that stage, I hadn't thoughts of business, or I hadn't thoughts of staying in Vietnam particularly. When you're 28, you don't make long-term plans. So what's happened after that is coincidence and inertia, as much as planning.
So you used some quite enchanting words about Vietnam in a very mysterious, in a good way, kind of like a alluring kind of way. You're quite the wordsmith, I would say, by the way, Dom. So thank you. You're keeping me engaged here. My previous guest, you just met as he was walking out of the studio. His grandfather was part of the French resistance during World War II, and after the war, and had some religious persecution issues as well. After the war, was sent to Vietnam as part of the French army attachment to reclaim Vietnam, right? And he was telling me the story, and the podcast for him will come out later too. I'll send it to you, where it was like a horror show for him for basically 15 years because France was occupied for some time, and then obviously you would think you can celebrate that, but no, colonialism took priority, and the government decided to ship its hardworking people to go somewhere else again. And he said something similar, like that he didn't use the word alluring or mysterious or whatever you had said before to come back to Vietnam, but it kind of triggered this memory, this kind of like subliminal messaging, like, oh, I should check out this place because my family lineage almost in a way was impacted by Vietnam, and in a good way, not a bad way, just more like I want to learn more how this influenced my family.
Well, I don't have any family connections with Vietnam, actually, other than my family now, but no historical connections. I do think, so I'm now 62, So I think for people, Western people, and I'm thinking probably Europeans rather, I mean, US citizens have their own extraordinary memories of that period, right? But and I don't want to overstate it either as well. So let's stick with the subliminal concept. But most definitely, 70s and 80s, 1970s and 1980s, there was a subliminal presence. Yes. And then, of course, as one got into the late 80s and 90s, Vietnam was in the news because of people leaving the country, of course. I actually happened to be in Hong Kong, so in fact, there was a daily Vietnamese presence on the news in Hong Kong from people arriving. So, but that was such an extraordinary concept that didn't affect me one way or another with regards to coming here. As I said, I think there was a fascination with the country. If you can imagine driving from north to south in 1990, I mean, I think one of the foundational memories was National Route 1A outside Nha Trang, the road being built by local workers, most of whom were women, and the driver leaning out of the window and offering money to one of the women who was huddled there putting stones into the road because of the gratitude that driver felt. He didn't know her, he had no question at all, but that gratitude that he felt that here was a woman who was helped building this national road. I mean, I've always remembered that. And so, yes, fascination with the history, fascination with also the natural beauty of Vietnam and nature of the people. I'm sure everyone who's on your podcast talks about the nature of Vietnamese people. And there are many, many facets to Vietnamese people, and not everyone is perfect. None of us are all perfect, but there are some very strong characteristics that, fell very much into the mix. And you stick the old banh mi and a bit of coffee and a check hat, and you're there.
You're there. I think this podcast will single-handedly increase tourism, especially from the UK, Dom. So thank you. Dom, you've been an influential figure yourself. You, according to my notes, have been, nominated as the most famous Englishman in Vietnam. I'm not sure if that means anything to the folks listening here today, but it means a lot to the UK community at least. Who has somebody in your last 30 years here in Vietnam, 30 plus for that matter, that has left a lasting impact on you? And you mentioned your drive down from north to south, and I'm sure you've done that many times. It's not just perhaps another famous person, maybe it is, quote unquote, a business person that you met, or perhaps even someone on that road trip that left that lasting memory of what's guided you over these years here in Vietnam.
It would be unfair for me to try and point a finger at one person. And indeed, it would be wrong for me to say that there's one person who's responsible for, the way I feel about this country. There are many people. There's actually, my mum in the UK who, many years after I left, I mean, she's been a regular visitor here, but she looks at me one day and she goes, I know why you're doing this. There's that sort of understanding and acceptance of one's life that plays a very important role. My teacher was tremendous. I've lost touch with him. Điều, khiến, thấy, if you're listening to this. He introduced me to the Vietnamese language, and of course, in those days, that was Vietnamese culture, it was Vietnamese history. We were together for 2 years, individually, him and me, and a toad that occasionally came into the room. A remarkable man. He couldn't speak English, and I couldn't speak Vietnamese, but he was a Lao linguist, and I'd studied Thai, so we occasionally had to, go through that doorway if we got really stuck. But basically, we just made each other understand each other over 2 years, And that was, he bedded me in, so unforgettable always. And then while I was in Hanoi, a range of characters. My landlady spoke very good French and some Japanese and no English, and her son, who spoke good Russian, a little bit of French and no English, and their daughter, who spoke good English and a little bit of French and no Russian. All the people who lived opposite. They had a tapois, introduced me to the fact you buy your own tet tree, don't nick anyone else's or give anyone a tree. And I'm sorry, this is such a remarkable question that it goes, I've been married here. One wife died. That's an unforgettable experience, of course. And then there are people in, my partners, my business partners, who are mostly Vietnamese. And of course, in the business world, there are regulators and there are figures within the government edifice who have the particular difficulty of being in the government edifice and trying to move things forward, but also being sometimes stuck in the government edifice. Cultural figures. I'd have to mention Bao Ninh, whose book The Sorrow of War was published when I was a student in Hanoi, and very quickly translated into English and won a reasonably prominent foreign literature prize in 1990, I think 1991 or 1992. And any of your listeners who haven't read The Sorrow of War, I strongly recommend it. It's almost indescribable. It's very lyrical, but it's sort of an indescribable portrayal of the experience of a generation. And that book grabbed me, and I was fortunate enough to meet Bao Ninh a few years after, and of course the book was not that popular by then, but he has come back and I think is now a national treasure. On Monday, he was the first of 50 authors to be celebrated as part of the cultural celebrations of this very special year, 2025. And I had aspirations to help that book become a movie, which it hasn't yet, because for anybody who's read the book, it's fearsomely a difficult proposition to turn this work into a filmic experience. I hope it does happen. Obviously, way beyond my meager talents.
Tom, I think as someone that lives here myself, I hear about some of your work, and actually I hear more about your artistic kind of side as well. And I mention that because I think it's worth for the audience to know your interest in what drives you every day, gets you up in the morning, is not just what you do at Dragon Capital. And by the way, we'll talk about that in a little bit, and also your artistic appreciation and love for Vietnamese art and culture. Could you talk a little bit about why you have that interest and perhaps your journey in exploring art and anything else that I may not know about in that space?
Well, I'd have to say one remarkably positive and uplifting aspect of life in Vietnam is that because of its circumstances perhaps, but most definitely because of its people, there is an ebullient atmosphere that's receptive to new ideas, and new ideas don't get sunk in nihilism or lethargy or inertia or bureaucracy, which I think they do in many civilizations in the world. I've always loved the fact that the word for no in Vietnamese is not yes. And of course, often that means not yet. And there is this sort of positive atmosphere that means that if you have ideas, you can explore them. And art, generally, art is part of all of us, right? But when I was in Hanoi, one of the areas that it seemed to be freed and more experimental and more open and more vibrant was visual arts. And so I was lucky enough to meet a few of the painters, artists around Hanoi in the early 90s. And I developed an interest in self-portraiture because self-portraiture I think it requires extreme courage from artists to portray themselves. To portray anything is pretty brave, but to portray yourself, and particularly the sort of rapid changes that were occurring or are still occurring in Vietnam, it's a very interesting way of charting or looking or recording. And actually also, while I was in Hanoi, I became enamored with what a lot of people call propaganda art, political art. Because in fact, in the early 90s, the private sector was not widely confident. And so, there weren't neon signs and names. In fact, the places I used to go and eat, the restaurants, most of the restaurants we knew by their numbers, their street numbers. 22, 14. In my street, there was 57. There was a bunch of them. And that was how they were known. So, but the political art, the propaganda, was colourful, big, visible. I think a lot of local people at the time perhaps didn't pay enormous attention to it, because when I tried to find out about it, I found there wasn't much knowledge. There wasn't much of a body of study. So these two strands have sort of pulled and pushed me over the years, and they've evolved into a little bit of a platform we call the Dogma Collection. And actually, we have an annual art prize. The finalists show for which is tomorrow if you're free and anywhere near Tao Dien, 6:00.
Actually, yeah.
Yeah, well, you'd be most welcome. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
It'll be fun. Yeah, yeah. So we do shows. We do about 3 or 4 shows a year. We have some other initiatives, some research initiatives, and it's an interesting part of the journey. Basically, it doesn't really have an end game. I mean, it's all about Vietnam, Vietnamese people, and how they, their history. I'm particularly interested in the history. Actually, we've built a reasonable archive of not just propaganda art, but photography, stamps, and combat art. And I'm particularly proud of the stamps, actually, because stamps are a little bit of a weird thing, right? Young people, I don't think, you don't use stamps now.
I don't think they even know what it is.
No, exactly right. But stamps chart history. And I've managed, through various pieces of luck, to have put together a 52 album collection of stamps from 1945 to 1995. And it's very complete. And very, it has, in the world of stamps, you have the original drawing for a stamp, which is called the essay. You then have the printer's proof, and then you have the minted unfranked stamp. Then you have the frank stamp. Then you have the misprint, where for some extraordinary reason the hat's on the wrong way round, or the house doesn't have a roof. And then you have forgeries, and then you have fantasies. Fantasy was described to me as a forgery of something that never existed, which is an interesting term. And so the collection that we have put together includes sort of elements of all of these over that long period of time, and its historical impact. So where we could find the right destination, that certainly is part of Vietnam's future historical record.
I think we can create an entire story around each stamp. Like that would be the most incredible, like, not to say you should do a lecture or something. Like, I would literally attend a lecture every week where you or someone else talked about the origin of that stamp, the history, why it's important to Vietnam, or whatever the story is. It reminds me of my aunt, actually. Her name is Swan Phương, my family member. She's
yes.
a big art collector too.
Yes. Okay.
And every few weekends, maybe once every 6 months, I'll bring like a group of friends over, because she was one of our podcasts before.
Okay.
And she became like super famous after that, apparently. She lives at Saigon Pearl, and she says whenever she's just going around, people will stop her now. And whenever I do come to her house, occasionally I'll like ask her, like, hey, on this day of the year, so November or December 4th or whatever day we're on today, could you tell me around this time, like, an artist that you met, or some important part of your 96 plus years of life that an artist like made an impression on you? And she'll just ask her like assistant to like bring out a piece of art, and she'll spend 2 hours talking about how this person passed away during the war and did this and did that, and why she keeps it and why she'll never sell it, because there's people always knocking on her door to buy it. I think your collection, Dom, talking about your love for art in general, I have seen some of it online, and thank you for the invite, by the way. I probably will come, but I'll double check later. I think, these elements of Vietnamese history, the youth especially, deserve to know more about it, deserve to just even know that it exists. Because, like, I made the joke that they don't even know what stamps are. They probably don't. Actually, they never even mailed something before.
Funny you should say that. So we have two young ladies. We have a curator and an assistant curator. One is Vietnamese from the US, and the other is from here. And they've been very successful in generating a rapport with young Vietnamese. So actually, the shows we do, I invite along, my cohort of slightly older people. But actually, what's joyful is the engagement that one can see from young Vietnamese people with their history, and it's a great thing to do. And of course, as you say, there are so many stories here that one doesn't know really where to look.
Share with me, when you say joy or interest or whatever you want to call it, what is that exactly? Is it for instance, people love to share that during football games after Vietnam wins an under 21 match over this, and they've qualified or they've won a tournament, and the city just goes crazy. The country goes crazy, and people think Vietnam won the World Cup.
Yes.
I want to bring it back to what you just said, interest, or joy. What could you describe that a little bit, and perhaps why you think?
I think for people my age in this country, or maybe somewhat younger, much of life has been about trying to establish some visibility and sustainability, and family, and looking after those needs. And it's not always been easy, and it's taken time, right? I think that's been quite preoccupying for younger people, and Gen Z, alphas. I think they're fortunate in a way. They would say they've got many challenges, but they're fortunate in a way that they don't have necessarily the same set of concerns as their parents, and they're able to look at things in a less constricted way. And I think it's become particularly true this year, actually. But I mean, it was true for Dogma last year, and in recent years, that people are happy to engage with their history. and indeed even to be proud of their history, but certainly to be curious about their history.
Do you believe there are enough avenues to spark that curiosity? So of course you have the education system. That's a whole nother discussion. But even after that, so as a young adult, let's say, you just finished university, you've learned some stuff in history class. Okay, great. And then are there enough cultural, historical avenues? And perhaps if not, what do you think we as a community could do to drive more of that interest? Or
Well,
engagement?
no, I'd have to say there aren't, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that. If one is a parent and there's some there's some young kids, what do you do at the weekend? That I was fortunate enough to grow up as maybe you were as well, or many people here, where the weekends you could go to art galleries, you could go to museums, collections. There was always something new, something to do. I'd salute the contemporary art world here, because I do think there's quite a lot going on there. I'm sure almost every weekend and a lot of days during the week, there are individual events occurring, not just in this city here, but throughout the country, and most particularly in Hanoi. So I think that's a scene that's quite lively and active. But in terms of repositories of cultural information, no. I think the current leadership of this country is expressing some awareness of this, and I think there are plans to tackle this, to put culture onto a new, culture with a small c into a new format, and I would be a huge supporter of that.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak from the more, I guess, from the headlines, right? You have that new opera house, I think, that's being built in Hanoi.
Yeah,
Quite
which is
interesting.
open.
It's already open, really.
And the London Symphony Orchestra, I met the director of it, who has been coming out here for a couple of years now, and said it's absolutely superb in terms of acoustics and equipment. It's absolutely superb. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have some of the real estate things, the actual platforms, the avenues to actually amplify these. So that's coming, and I think the government has been very active in promoting that and kind of driving that, right?
Yeah.
And so have some private companies, I'm sure. I don't know who exactly.
Yeah,
is behind that,
there's the emergence of private museums, isn't there? There's
Yeah.
now a legal and regulatory framework for that to happen. So, yes, great. It feels like things are bubbling up, and there may be some more of that. I think you've got, a regulatory framework which is supportive or at least not obstructive, and you've got a demographic that is interested, and you maybe have quasi providers who have the resources and the time and the interest. So you can see these things coming together. Yeah.
On that point, we're talking a lot about like driving the interest locally, engaging, having those platforms created to even create that engagement. What do you think about Vietnamese culture, art, and even knowledge being exported, being like, interest in the UK and the US? I'm not trying to say like, oh, buy some more Vietnamese art abroad, right? I don't think that's the goal here, but even just awareness or appreciation. If we were to use the upper echelons of example, K-pop going to the world, K-dramas going to the world. Do you think there's an interest in that, a potential? Is it going to happen? If so, how long?
I think it's a really interesting question, a really interesting question, and one I'm sure we're not the only people who are thinking about that. I mean, in the motto of this year, which me and my mates we term it the era of ascendance.
Okay.
Although there are different translations, aren't there?
Well, how do you say that in Vietnamese?
Kỷ nguyên vươn mình. Kỷ nguyên vươn mình. The mantra of 2025. And enthusiasm, ambition, self-confidence, very obviously in the economic growth sense, right? But I think more than that, the cultural sense, there's been some interesting movies this year, expressing confidence in the past, confidence in the future. And of course, from an economic point of view, one might go, well, is Vietnam got one eye on the Korean journey? And in economic terms, you can begin to put some comparator bricks together. But you don't go very far before you get your K-pop question. The Korean journey has been characterized by its enormous success in developing and exporting Korean culture. And I think it's fair to say at the moment, Vietnam has not.
Well, what would you say are the potential winners from Vietnam? So I don't name names or brands, but like almost categories, because it's easy for me to say K-pop, K-drama, because obviously those stick out. But it's not like suddenly I could say the same about, let's say, Japanese culture. Actually, J-pop, I guess, or J-dramas, to me, they don't exist as prominently. I'm sure they're out there, but for me, I don't know about them. Yeah. But when I think of Japanese culture, I think of Honda, I think of Toyota, I think of Pokemon, I think of Japanese food. I don't think of Korean food as much. So what do you think are those winners from Vietnam category?
Well, you'd have to suggest, it's a good question, isn't it? But you'd have to suggest that cuisine has led and is leading Vietnamese cultural engagement with the world, right? The humble banh mi is in every cuisine in the world right now, isn't it? So I think that's a given, and that's a great thing, of course. Cuisine export, culinary exports. I come from a country which is not known for its culinary exports, but it's clear. China, Italy, Japan, and now Vietnam, extremely successful at exporting, and when you talk people through their stomach, I mean, you engage on the right level, right? It's the gut. That's the key determinant of feelings. But where are some of the others? Yes, it's a really good question. It's a really good question.
Well, while you're thinking, if the audience feels like they know a few and they want to suggest some, let us know in the comments below. But we'll sit on that for a little bit, Dom, because I know
tourism. Just what that. I mean, okay. Tourism. You're not leaving the country, but it's definitely been a big spot. I think a big high spot is
lowest hanging fruit.
Lowest hanging fruit. Yeah. Enormously successful.
That would drive billions of economic value for the country too, if done.
Economic value, and also people come here and then they understand, and a lot of the investment clients of Dragon Capital first came here as tourists. And I think the same is true in lots of things. People engaging in public health or in public services. Yeah.
Okay. I think this all sounds good. I agree a lot as well. What would you say are the things that are taking away from that potential for Vietnam from like an outside point of view? Because I think you just mentioned yourself, some investors in Dragon, they come here as tourists, they love it, they see the energy, but perhaps there's some darker sides to Vietnam. Not in a bad way, it's just kind of like, how do we get over that hump? So for example, you say Vietnamese cuisine. I think everybody loves it, so do I. With that said though, like let's say street food. I love street food, but also it keeps hitting the headlines recently, especially people keep getting sick.
Yeah.
And I remember some of my friends be like, oh, wow, is it safe to go eat in Ho Chi Minh City? I'm like, yeah, I mean, like 99% of places, What would you say are those little things maybe hampering Vietnam? And so
I don't know. I mean, yes, you're right to point the headlines recently, but I'm sure that all of your listeners would agree that nobody needs to be excessively concerned about Vietnamese street cuisine, or that's not an issue. I mean, picking some challenges. I mean, I think infrastructure is a challenge. I mean, broadly speaking, physical infrastructure. We've talked, you just talked about the absence of, cultural infrastructure, right? But also streets. It took me a surprising length of time to come here.
Sorry about that.
No, that is one thing you're not responsible for, mate. But, just getting around, and I think that's true for I think that's true. Most obviously true for Vietnamese people. You know, most flights are delayed now for a little bit, aren't they? And
there's hope on the horizon. Hopefully.
Yeah, of course, and that's a good thing. And you know, inshallah, that will.
I do have a data-driven point about that actually, just in the last few weeks. So on our Instagram, we create all this content, and the English one, not the Vietnamese one, and we wrote an article that Vietnam is building 30 airports by 2030. I don't know if that's actually factual. We'll do a fact check later, but that's, if I remember correctly, what was stated in the article. And the engagement on that post was like 20 times the normal posts.
How is that
People
right?
were commenting, people were sharing, people were liking it. They're like, oh, you know, the good and the bad comments, you know, the people that like to hate on, you know, oh, it's not going to happen. And then people are like, yeah, you know, that's, I found that so curious because it is top of mind for people that, hey, the country is just getting so big, fast growing, economic growth. But of course, the downsides are everything's slower as a result. There's not enough efficiency. The immigration lines are a bit long. So how can we solve that? And it is, but it's on the way.
What was the engagement about? I read a recent article about Saigon sinking. So that's another issue in the same vein. What was the engagement on that one?
A lot too.
Yeah.
I don't remember the exact, but yes, I remember that one as well.
Yeah. So let's agree that, I mean, both from the positive and the challenging points of view, infrastructure is a big issue, right? It's how you get to work. It's how you,
or even the tourism experience when they arrive in Vietnam. The first and last thing they always remember is the airport. So if it's robust, or at least, you know, then already like half the game of attracting them back for a second visit's already done. Let's put it that way. So lots of opportunity there, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose other challenges, you know, with growth, and this isn't just a Vietnamese thing, but with growth, you get the risks of, you know, discrepancies in income.
Income inequality, basically.
Income inequality. When nobody has anything, this is what you always hear, isn't it? When nobody has anything, people share very, very openly. But by the time people are caught in the material world, then you get discrepancies, and they exist everywhere. It's really a case of how society deals with those. And I think in traditional Western countries right now, it's very clear those issues are not being dealt with very well at all. Does anybody have a silver bullet? I don't know. Magic wand? I don't know. Really, it would be wrong for Vietnam to try and impersonate northern Scandinavia. That's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a different ball game. I will have to say about that too. When I first came to Vietnam as a Vietnamese American, second time actually, I was an adult at that time, so I could think more clearly. But I think I was 2015. And by the way, I'm about half your age, Dom. So you don't look double my age, but I just want to note that, especially with those socks. But I remember thinking, like, there are no homeless people here. I know that was just visually. I don't actually know, but just visually, at least Ho Chi Minh City. When you go from the airport to the city, everybody is working. Nobody is just like chilling in a bad way. Or chilling as in like just walking around begging, right? Even everyone that's just sitting down, it's because they're like a security guard or like manning their tapua or whatever, right? So that is the admirable part about Vietnam that I specifically sticks out to me to this day, and I think still stands mostly true. Of course, there's some homeless people. I mean, I've seen some recently, but obviously not as bad as like our hometowns, right? I mean,
No, exactly
the UK
right.
and the US, it's horrible. I think
It's horrible. People are stepping over people
feces
lying and people in the in doorways and stuff. It's really
thanks so much for sharing that cultural overview and commentary. You know, that's a whole nother podcast, and it was already kind of spinning in my head. I was like, we should definitely get all these people that Dom's gone through in his life to, not on this podcast perhaps, but we have other shows, and I think we can amplify that cultural message to the young people. So that's another note for another day.
Great, fantastic.
But Dom, I do want to bring us back to kind of the one that makes the headline for Dom, right? Which is you're the founder, the chair, I believe, CEO, whatever it is, of Dragon Capital, Dragon for me, as someone that used to be an investment professional myself, I used to work in venture capital
Okay.
in Vietnam.
Okay.
It was like the standard, sorry, of the sterling grade, I think is what they call it back in the UK, right? Of investment firms in Vietnam, and there's only a few that sit in that category. So firstly, congratulations. But second, I'm very grateful to even be sitting here with you today to ask these questions. Why Dragon, the name? Let's take a step back and maybe that sets the tone.
I never had any doubt about that whatsoever. One of the first books, it might even have been the very first book I read about Vietnam, was called A Dragon Apparent. Superb book, by the way. A well-known, I think he's an American anthropologist, traveler called Norman Lewis. He wrote a book about visiting Vietnam in 1940s and 50s. And he talks about his first experience in Hanoi in 1949. And he comes out of his hotel and he sees a bus, and probably it would be called an omnibus in those days maybe, run into a bicycle. Luckily the cyclist is not badly hurt, but his bicycle is under the bus. And he watches as the cyclist approaches the bus driver, and the bus driver gets out of the bus, and they throw their arms around each other to celebrate their good fortune that nobody was hurt. That's wonderful. Anyway, that book's called A Dragon Apparent. And of course, the history of Vietnam and its people, in mythical terms, does stem from a dragon. Laid 50 eggs, 100 eggs, and 50 eggs hatched, and 50 went to the mountains and 50 went to the deltas. So dragon is distinctly, part of Vietnam, isn't it? The name for the Mekong Delta, Củ Lâm, 9 dragons. The dragon, I particularly like the fact that the dragon, as I understand this, in Asian symbolism, is the personification of qi, or energy, and is therefore symbolic of life, really. So there's lots of Vietnamese reasons. I come from near Wales, which is a small principality in what's left of Britain. And Wales has a symbol and is also a dragon.
Mm. Are you actually Welsh, by the way? Or are you
I'm not Welsh,
okay,
but my
close enough.
half of my family experience is in Wales.
Okay.
Yeah, to this day, and I'm engaged in various aspects of Wales, although I don't speak Welsh. But the symbol of Wales is a dragon. It's a dragon with wings, so it's a slightly different dragon to the Vietnamese dragon. But I mean, that's such an obvious link up with all of those words. And luckily, at the time, nobody else had chosen the name Dragon Capital. Since then, of course, a firm in Ukraine, just after we did it, a firm in Ukraine started, and they're still going. They're called Dragon Capital as well. Mm-hmm. Poor fellas.
Okay. Well, very cool. Thank you for that sharing. Again, quite the story, especially given the connection to your home, right? Wales, in particular, your cultural kind of upbringing. Thank you for sharing that. I would love for you to share with me, over the years, you've talked to all these different types of investors and ways of working, culturally. Vietnamese is very different from that country, this country, etc. What would you share as a very high level comment about your experience working with Vietnamese investors, Vietnamese partners, compared to the ones that you also work with every day who are not Vietnamese? Some takeaways that perhaps.
Well, I noticed what you say about Viet Cetera. One of your mission can be described as bringing the world to Vietnam and bringing Vietnam to the world, and of course, that's to an extent that's what we have to do in what is our job in Dragon. So it happens through the capital markets, right? Through the equity market, the debt market. So we're dealing with principally with Vietnamese issuers, companies that are looking for investors, and then we find investors who are principally but not exclusively from overseas, and we're in the middle. And around the markets, we have to try and make sure that things work, and there are always differences. But I'm sure I'm not the first person on your podcast to say that the Vietnamese ability to go up the learning curve quickly is most impressive.
I want to talk about that word quickly that you just used, because for those of you that know the history, high level of Vietnam, embargo ended in 95, more or less, something like that. So basically only the last 30 years have you seen all these skyscrapers start hitting the skyline, or the new airports that we see being built. It's all happening right now. So it is, in a way, quickly.
It's less than a generation, right?
Less than a generation,
you might say it's one Korea, sort of.
Yeah.
But yeah, very quickly.
And I mean, worth noting, you mentioned Korea and all these other countries, perhaps they benefited a lot from like foreign external help, like either the UN or even the US. Even after World War II, you look at Europe, it got a lot of support from the US.
Sure.
Vietnam, not really. I mean, so the Eastern Bloc, right, did at some stage, but even then, toward the late 80s, 90s, they weren't doing so hot either. So Vietnam was essentially alone for some time, a little bit. I'm not a history expert, so I can't say it.
But I think you're right. Prior to the removal of the American embargo, I think that would probably be a linchpin moment, because that's the US embargo also embargoed all multilateral assistance. So the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, IFC, the ADB, all of these letterboxes were barred from anything other than strictly humanitarian assistance to Vietnam until 1994. So when that happened, when that changed, lots of other stuff could change. And it did. And, for many years, foreign aid was a huge driver. It's now, of course, a bit player, really. I think Vietnam respects its aid partners, but they're just not that significant these days. Yeah. So another linchpin, though, would be the foreign investment legislation in Vietnam, which, I mean, technically dates from 1989, the very first expression of a foreign investment law. And so that was creating an environment in which people could, foreign investors could engage with Vietnam and Vietnamese entities such as they were. But of course, in those days, it was really the state sector and some state enterprises. It wasn't really any private sector to speak of could engage with foreign investors. And so that was an early sign of willingness, I think. I mean, it's interesting in the chronology, 1986 Doi Moi, the original focus was on the agricultural sector, right? Quite logically. Give farmers a greater degree of accountability for the land on which they occupy. But the second plank of Doi Moi was opening to the foreign community, the foreign investment community. And it's only the first company law for Vietnamese companies was 1992. So that was actually the third of those. And obviously they've all gone at different speeds since then. But I think the foreign investor engagement in Vietnam has been quite important. I think if you look, if one looks at the numbers now, the number of people who work for foreign invested companies is not that many. It's not that great, I don't think. Is it 2 million people? Something like that. But when you look at the scale of capital that foreign investment has brought in, and perhaps even more importantly than that, ideas, technology, knowledge of markets, knowledge of management, knowledge of governance, I think that's been hugely significant. But back to your point, Vietnamese people, Vietnamese institutions, Vietnamese practices have learned extremely quickly from that. And so, one talks to foreign investors they came here with their initial expectations, and they were able to, double up on that, and then maybe sometimes double up more and go more rapidly up the curve than they had originally anticipated. And that's a great, to the enormous credit of Vietnam and its people, right?
I'm going to do a little role play right now, Dom. I'm going to pretend to be an LP of Dragon Capital. In the investment process, there's kind of 3 stages. You have the honey, not even the honeymoon, the dating period, trying to know if there's a commitment. Then there's the actual deployment of funds. The LPs on the investment community or committee, things are going, etc. And then there's the post-mortem.
Yeah.
There's been an exit. Has it been successful? Has it not? So let's have a bit of a scenario here in the dating side of things. You have a 1-hour meeting with an LP. Compared from 1994 to today, how much time is spent on the actual introduction of Vietnam versus the actual deal itself? So out of that 60-minute lunch meeting that you have, is it like, back then it was like the entire meeting was about Vietnam, not even the deal.
Exactly.
And then today it's like 2 minutes and then you go to the deal.
Yeah.
What is it in practicality today?
Very little. You're spot on. How everyone who's professionally aware has a good idea of where Vietnam is, where it's come from, what the drivers are, what's going on. I think there are still areas that people are curious about, and those are the areas that, as you get more knowledgeable about something, you drill down on. So, I think there's still a great deal of interest in the way that the politics of this country work, because it's not that obvious. If you're sitting in a foreign somewhere or other, actually how decisions occur and how the process evolves and how people, I think there's but of course that's endlessly speculative. Yeah. And as one of my partners said once, don't worry about that, just get on with your business. And so, where it really counts, where the cookie crumbles, is what are you investing in? What's going right about it? What are the challenges? What are the risks? And how are those being managed? And I would say that is quite rightly the most significant part. Of course, I work in financial flows, so it's very important that there's contextualizing those flows. So there's a lot of what's going, in addition to what's going on in the business and the company, it's the environment. So you things like foreign exchange rates and monetary policy and fiscal policy, and these things become they're never very far away. So those would also occupy some of the discussion. And in fact, in my world, people would be more interested. That would be their context. It wouldn't be about Vietnamese history or the number of provinces, even though that's changed pretty dramatically this year. But it would be much more the sort of macroeconomic policy context that people would start at.
So let's talk about deployment, and then also, so that's the second stage. It's not as nice sounding as dating, but deployment, and then also post-mortem. I don't know if that's the appropriate word to use. I couldn't think of another one. Post-deal, whatever, post-exit.
Yeah.
What are the most common kind of perhaps misunderstandings that you think you sharing today would help future LPs make decisions better, make decisions faster, put more money into Dragon Capital, that you want to share today, so that you're being as not just you, but also the markets being as open about its opportunities, but also challenges?
So we're in the process of investing here, right? We've done the dating, actually engaged. So information flows, these are important. I don't think there's a big problem with those, actually. I think I've never really had a problem getting information. emerging problems. This is definitely part of the
like the unpredictability, perhaps.
yeah,
like
and
everything from tariffs
expectations
to,
and how decisions are made. I mean, I for me, it's an overused word, but it's rightly overused. Governance. Governance is such an important
private companies.
of everything.
Okay.
The term is corporate governance in this that we're talking about, but governance generally is it's how people make decisions, and therefore it's like how people are accountable. It's the process for which the decisions are made, and then it's where's the accountability among various parties for those decisions that are made. And it comes up very often. It comes up, I mean, to talk in clear terms in Vietnam, if you look at the universe where I'm active, half of the companies come from the state sector through privatization, and half come from the private sector, which is individuals or families that have got together. Governance is an issue in both of those, because the way that the state sector and its entities makes decisions is driven by the priorities and the background of the drivers of the state. Similarly, or perhaps slightly differently, in the private sector, decisions are made. In some cases, decisions are made, because of family dynamics. In some cases, they're made because of power dynamics. It's very important to understand how those matters occur. And I'm certainly not going to say that Vietnamese governance is bad or wrong, but what the absolute key to understanding an investment before you make it, when you make it, and as you're with it, is to understand how decisions are made.
Dom, I love how you talked about corporate governance, because all the other, especially finance people or even companies that I talk to, this is becoming so top of mind because liquidity in this market is quite low. The public markets are not super mature yet, although the whole FTSE upgrade is interesting, and that's a whole nother podcast. But so some bright spots ahead. With that said, kind of the joke I was about to make was like, what's the most number of books that you've seen at a company? Because if you look at the headlines, not Vietnam, but for instance, in the region in Indonesia, in the startup ecosystem at least, there was a company called eFishery that raised something like $300 million from really reputable firms. SoftBank, I think Temasek was even, involved. I forget, someone from the Singapore government, EDPI maybe it was. And despite those funds having likely very rigorous due diligence procedures, they still invest, but second, they still got screwed after, right? And they're holding taxpayer dollars. They're holding LP money from Europe, from US, and it sucks to see that, basically, right? Because we know that they're an amazing company here and amazing people building cool stuff, and maybe obviously the 1% that, or maybe it's even larger, I don't know, that are not doing it in a quote unquote corporate governance way that makes the whole community more confident and more healthy about the future of the private sector is something to look out for. So, and one thing I also wanted to know is you mentioned about like family businesses and how they make decisions. I think the next 5 to 10 years in Vietnam are going to be so fascinating because the next gen is coming right now. They've all just finished studying. Maybe they have already. Some of them studied abroad. They're all coming back home. They're in their late 20s, 30s, 40s. And their parents, their families, they are retiring. And what's going to happen? There's a decision tree here, right? It's like, do we hire a professional BOD, run the whole shop? We collect dividends? Do we sell the whole business? Do we run it into the ground?
I think there's
so many cool things.
That's a hugely interesting question, and I think you nail on the head. I don't have the energy for it, but if I was a bit younger and I was looking for a business idea, that's the idea I'd go for.
You do.
The succession of Vietnamese. We were talking earlier, modern Vietnam is really a career old. It's 30 years. And the people who architected that are coming to the end. And what happens next is such an interesting question. And as I understand, my honest view is it's not right now. People are not engaging with that very well. The whole question of succession is not being addressed at all well by the Vietnamese corporate sector, and I think you could say it about any part of it. It's very time consuming. I know this from my own personal experience. It's very time consuming. It's years of time and learning and many mistakes along the way. And there's no right and wrong, but it has to happen because sure as hell, time cannot be stopped. So it's got to happen, and I think there's a very interesting investment. I actually haven't worked it out what it is yet, but there's a really interesting investment thesis there. Really, really interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess more functionally, it's been going through my mind quite a bit. Like just in the past year, I've met so many folks, Vietnamese and foreigners coming in, trying to start search funds, roll-ups, and all these fancy things that you see in the West, right? And it's never been done here. So the question is, you've built a firm that is more diversified now, but of course started in a more simple way. And there's only a few of you guys in this market, and there's a reason why, because it's both highly, high opportunity, but highly complex how to navigate that. Not all structures are made equal in terms of partnerships here too. I think you have to be comfortable working in a bit of a gray area and not knowing exactly what's going to happen the next day. Whereas folks in your LPs in Australia and Europe and wherever, that's the complete opposite of what they know. So lots of opportunities ahead. I think, again, a whole nother podcast series, I think, that we can talk about that, and super cool. By the way, I'm learning a lot. Thank you, Dom. It's such a pleasure to just hear your words here today, especially the cultural piece, by the way. I think that deserves so much more attention. Yeah. Everybody around the world is thinking about trade, tariffs, economic growth, geopolitical stuff. Okay, blah, blah, blah. But the cultural stuff is actually, even in my view, more interesting. So lots to talk about. Dom, it's almost our lunchtime. I'm really sorry that we can't keep talking.
Thank you.
But we do have one last question for you. I ask most of my guests on my show the same question. We have you on the podcast today because we want you to share your stories, your insights, your experiences so that our audience can learn from you. What's something that's keeping you up and you're interested about so that we can invite a guest on this show and you can learn from them?
Okay, well, that's a very big question, isn't it? That's a very big question. And so if I were to give an answer which fits in that space, I would be inclined to say something along the lines, well, I'd predicate it by stating that one of the considerable threats to the human species is the absence of spirituality. And a question for younger people, for me to listen to, would be how they might approach life without spirituality, whether that's a viable proposition or whether the absence needs to be filled and how it would be filled.
Okay. Spirituality. No, I love it. I think in this day and age where, especially headlines, right, and that's what young people are looking at, social media, we're so consumed with metrics, with likes.
Yes.
I read a recent report that was done across generations about what is, and this is U.S., keep in mind, what is considered a successful salary in the U.S. And I think my mom's and dad's generation boomers were something like 90,000, which is enough, at least back then, quote unquote. That's a respectable salary, even after taxes and paying your house and all that. You still got something, you can send your kids to school. And then I think my generation was like, I'm a millennial, it was 170, 160. I mean, my generation, we're living in San Francisco where the rent's like $5,000 a month or something, right? So you can't really compare. And then like the Gen Alpha or Gen Z was something like 550,000 US dollars. I was like, my God, what's going on here? But it's because social media has taken over, where everyone's wearing a luxury bag, and of course no one does that.
That's very,
and then everyone's driving a
interesting, isn't it?
Ferrari, apparently, right?
The expectations and the aspirations and reality are becoming more and more divorced, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was the point I was trying to make. There is no spirituality anymore
No,
among young people,
no.
because I think, some social media content is basically brain rot. So how do you even have time for spirituality when you're just thinking about materiality?
Noting incidentally that I'm not no generation that I can point to has got this one right.
Sure.
But when I grew up, institutionalized spirituality was very much part of life, and lots of people had problems with that, but it was part of life, and it helped provide some sort of guide rails. Well, those don't exist at all now, and yet you've got all the other things you're talking about. So I would think it's a very difficult world to navigate.
Spirituality while bridging generations is also even a more interesting point to look at, because I think the folks that are thinking about what you just shared, mostly the generation that has gone through a lot. Right? Like, Dom, I hear your story today that you've had some personal challenges, you had some professional challenges, and we didn't even cover all of them today. So I think you have a lot to reflect on. But young people today too, they're also starting where there's almost like nothing to reflect on, or little, not very much. But then at the same time, all this content they're seeing, right? It's super easy to
be very
influence
confusing.
people.
Yeah,
It's very confusing.
Your point about salaries, that comparison is an interesting one. Really interesting.
I'll send that to you later.
Yeah,
I was shocked when I saw it as well. Thank you everyone for listening here today. Quite the podcast with our friend Dominic Scriven, the founder, chairman of Dragon Capital, but also quite the art lover, someone with really great viewpoints and sharings and experience about Vietnamese culture. One of the very unique gems of Vietnam society here today, sharing some knowledge with us. Dom, thank you so much for making time out of your very busy day and sharing some insights to our audience.
Thank you, Hao, and I apologize to you all for getting lost the last time.
It's okay, don't worry. I think if anything, we've built up the tension for this podcast over 2 months. So thank you so much, Dom. That was another episode of the Vietnam Innovators podcast. If you liked what you hear today, please subscribe. Let us know in the comments who else you want to hear from, or maybe you want to hear more from Dom. We can also share the feedback to him directly later for more sharing. Thank you so much, guys. See you next time. Bye-bye.